A look at what's going on in Latin America. The former left-wing president and first lady of Peru were just sentenced to 15 years in prison by a Peruvian court for laundering nearly $3 million from the Brazilian contractor Odebrecht and the Venezuelan government. The former president is Lula Humala and his wife is Nadine Heredia. Now, Odebrecht has been implicated in bribery scandals across Latin America over the past decade. Here's the part of the story that may cause a regional stir. Following the verdict, Heredia, the former first lady, sought asylum at the Brazilian embassy in Lima, Peru, under the 1954 Convention on Diplomatic Asylum, citing political persecution. And Brazil granted her asylum. Was this political persecution or just a criminal who had stolen $3 million on the run? This decision may strain Peru-Brazil relations. They've typically had a very, productive, positive, and working relationship until now. But Peru views these convictions as based on verified evidence, while Brazil's move could be seen as undermining the judiciary in Peru. This is playing out against a backdrop of eroding democratic conditions in Brazil, as explained to us by Brazilian Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro.
The lawfare that we're facing down there in Brazil is the same lawfare that Trump faced here. I usually say it's the same virus. The difference is that we have less antibodies in Brazil, which make things harder. Because in Brazil, you have the superior electoral court, and they decide who can run, who cannot run.
So wait a second, if you criticize the way they run elections, they don't let you participate in the elections?
Yes.
That's crazy. Joining us now, a Brazilian journalist who is always an expert on these things, host of the Paulo Figueiredo Show. Paulo Figueiredo, thanks so much for being with me. So before we get into this specific case with this Peruvian ex-first lady getting asylum in Brazil, talk a little bit about how people in Latin America think about these Odebrecht scandals where this major construction company was buying off politicians.
Well, it was more than just a corruption scandal. Odebrecht was the largest construction company in Brazil, one of the largest. They were big everywhere. They built a lot of stuff here in the United States as well. They were part of the expansion of the Miami International Airport and other important infrastructure projects. So they were very big. So they were not used only for corruption in the sense of politicians stealing money, but they were using to finance campaigns from the left all over Latin America. So what they used to do is that they used to hire Odebrecht to build something, a port or an infrastructure project in a certain country. Brazil would lend the money to the country, to the so-called infrastructure project. Odebrecht would use the money to finance the campaigns from leftists. So it was pretty much a way of the Lula government to finance the left expansion in Latin America. So this is the case we're talking about, and this is how Odebrecht worked. In Brazil, obviously, Brazil was the biggest case ever. It was probably the largest corruption scandal in the history of the world, and Lula da Silva, the sitting president of Brazil, was convicted for corruption and bribery in a case specifically like that.
So you've got, that is a brilliant explanation. So there you've got the overlay of the modus operandi, the scheme. It gets these Peruvians involved, and there is a conviction with a 15-year prison sentence, and then President Lula da Silva says potentially free passage into Brazil. How is that being received by Brazilians?
Well, it's obviously a shame. We're very ashamed because she has been granted asylum, and she's not being politically persecuted anywhere. She's being prosecuted, I should say, for corruption. She has been convicted for corruption. Her husband was the president from 2011 to 2016, and he was convicted for a corruption case involving Odebrecht, the Brazilian company. So it's not a humanitarian case. It's not why these treaties and agreements were designed for. It's just Lula da Silva, a socialist, a corrupt socialist, protecting one of his corrupt socialist friends.
And what do you think that will do to relations between Peru and Brazil going forward?
Well, that's to be seen. I think Brazil has been very clear that they're going to protect everyone that's aligned with them, no matter what. And the Lula government is aligned with everything that's the worst in the world. They're very aligned with Hamas. They're aligned with Iran. They're aligned, obviously, in bed with China. So that's the even North Korea. So they're aligned with everything that's bad in the world, and that's the foreign policy they have set since they took office in 2023 after Bolsonaro left office. So and people need to understand this. Lula da Silva is a communist. He is not only a socialist, he's an open communist, and he says so. And he's proud to be a communist. And they don't care about corruption. They don't care about anything. They care about power. And they're going to protect their allies, and they're going to go after and antagonize anyone that they think are not their allies, especially the United States. That's why the U.S. needs to understand that Lula da Silva cannot be reasoned with. He is a socialist, a communist, and he's going to pretty much work to expand socialists in Latin America as he has been doing
Paulo,
since he took office.
That last part is actually what's so interesting about this story, because you and I have been covering and talking quite frequently about the erosion of democracy within Brazil. But in this move, you see a desire to export that protection to fellow leftists who are convicted of corruption as an almost permission structure to say, look, if you want to take bribes from Brazil, you'll be protected by Brazil. If you want to adopt our political viewpoint, then you can always have refuge here. And it gets me wondering, when we think about exporting bad ideology in Latin America, we of course think of Cuba, we think of what has happened in Venezuela, but how close is Brazil to becoming in that same category as like a Cuba or Venezuela with a move like this?
Well, Brazil is already in the same category as Cuba or Venezuela in several senses. I can tell you that last year, X was shut down in Brazil, and it was operating very well in Venezuela, for example. The persecution of journalists or of political opposition in Brazil is just as bad as in Venezuela. In Venezuela, you had the president that couldn't run for office. You have the same thing right now with Bolsonaro losing his political rights. You have right now the Speaker of the Brazilian House being threatened by Moraes, the Supreme Court justice that shut down X and that we have been talking about, to not put on a vote a project to give amnesty to political prisoners in Brazil. So in several senses, Brazil is already just as bad as these other countries. It just looks better for the outside. What people don't realize is that Brazil is key to these other regimes because Brazil finances these other regimes. And as it did, and this is a specific case that shows that Brazil financed the left in Peru, Brazil financed the left in Venezuela, Brazil saved Cuba from completely bankruptcy with a program hiring Cuban doctors to work in Brazil and redirecting money to the Cuban government. So one thing, there's no way to fight the socialist expansion in Latin America if you allow the president of Brazil to be socialist, because Brazil is definitely richer than any other country in the region. Brazil is half of the GDP of South America alone. So if you leave Lula alone, he will just expand and finance socialism in other countries in the region.
That is the key point. I do want to get an update on another topic we've discussed before, this persecution of Jair Bolsonaro, the inability for Bolsonaro to run. Where does that all stand right now, and what are you covering most in that story?
Well, it's very sad. President Bolsonaro is right now in the hospital recovering from surgery that he had to do, is still suffering effects for his assassination attempt when he was running for office in 2018. So he still has some consequences of that assassination attempt, and he just suffered a problem that he had to undergo on surgery last week, and he's still in a very bad situation recovering in the hospital. But he's also facing a very harsh trial in the Supreme Court of Brazil being conducted by that Judge Moraes. He's already lost all his political rights, so he cannot run for office theoretically next year, although he's leading all the polls. And he's expected to be convicted for a supposed coup d'etat in the next few months. So
Well,
he's probably going to be sent to prison for his life.
That is incredible. We'll have to have you back on to dive deep into what the United States can do to sanction Justice Moraes and to take diplomatic action against Brazil to stop that from happening. Paulo Figueiredo, thank you so much for joining the program again.
Thanks for having me.